In last week's episode, we talked about whether or not the internet is a public place and the effect that that idea has on censorship and free speech. Let's see what you had to say. Scientific Methodist on the subreddit makes a bunch of really great points and starts a really awesome conversation that I highly recommend checking out if you have some extra minutes. But the one thing that I do want to address is a point that they bring up about my qualification that in those spaces where there is unfettered access to your right to free speech, and everybody understands that that's the case, you could say whatever you want as long as it's legal, that in and of itself, the qualification as long as it's legal is a complicated thing. And I think that I included that in the script as a kind of shortcut to like end an argument that I foresaw coming up and did not actually give it the thought or the consideration that I should have. To say that something is legal, I think, does not necessarily mean that it is right or should happen in certain communities. And, in a lot of ways, what we're talking about is how the law has not caught up with technology. So to say that things are okay in those situations because they are legal is to, I think, step away from the kind of nuance that I was at least trying to get at with this episode. So yeah, this is a great point, and I totally agree. Definitely a very hasty thing to have said. Dawn Butterfly also writes a comment that is really worth reading in its entirety, but just to pull out a couple ideas, they point out the concept of context collapse, which we get thanks to Dana Boyd and Alice Marwick, about how the internet sort of collapses social, temporal, like all these different kinds of spaces into one sort of weird continuous block, and that there is an important distinction to be made between public and accessible, that much of the internet is very accessible, and so that can make us feel as though it is public in a way, when in fact that is an important distinction. The thing that I think I really do want to focus on is the territory that we got into at the end of the episode, talking about the expectations that I think are reasonable to have, being, as Dawn Butterfly puts it, a touch utopic. And I think that that is absolutely true, and that this is something that came up a lot in conversation after the episode went up, that there's this question of resource, that in order to develop and support these communities and then manage these curated spaces in the way that I described, requires so much just person power. It requires technological power. It requires buy-in from the community. It requires all kinds of coordination. And there is a question as to whether or not we have either the systems, the capabilities, the understanding to develop resources that can support what I described. And I think that maybe is the question that a lot of people are asking, and I think part of what came up in that BuzzFeed article that I mentioned at the end of the episode, which is, how much of this is a design problem that we don't know how to design around. I think it's a very real problem, and one that I think seems in certain lights nearly impossible to solve. And I don't want to undersell the difficulty of it, but I also don't want to step away from it because it seems hard. Alice Powell writes a really interesting comment that I think starts to get at some of the complicated things surrounding the nature of harassment online. And really, I think a lot of how electronic communication works can sometimes change the nature of speech and the way that we communicate with one another online. And I think, one of the things that Alice talks about is understanding that YouTube is a place where you're gonna get negative comments, and life is a place where negative comments happen, sure, but that when you are inundated, when you are sort of the recipient of hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of those messages, they become something different. And this is the kind of like the quantity becomes quality argument. And that it's easy to say that one individual piece of communication, even if it's negative, is defensible, in that, someone should be able to say that. Someone can register their dislike with, say, a movie or a YouTube video, that the nature of that changes if it takes place within tens of thousands of those messages all happening at the same time. If the quality of that message is in some way, related to the quality of much more threatening messages, that this is I think a really complicated thing that we haven't really figured out how to deal with or how to talk about. The idea that there is sort of an individual unit of communication, and then there is the onslaught assemblage of communication, and how to sort of, manage between the two. So yeah, it's tough. There were more than a few comments, and I got some tweets over the week about how all of this relates to net neutrality, which I think is a really interesting question and something we didn't cover at all. So this has, I think, a lot to do with where you live, as does the free speech and the publicness question. But like in the US, for instance, ISPs were recently, as of I think last year, determined to be common carriers to support net neutrality. And so what that means is that as long as someone can pay for access to the internet, their information must be transported by the ISP through the internet pipes, the same as everybody else who can pay, so that there is no right for ISPs to refuse service or to charge for the same level, charge different things to different people for the same level of service. What we were talking about last week is one level sort of technologically higher, and something that RocketSurgeon I think states really well, that you can think of websites as opposed to ISPs as being publishers. So you are sending bits through the pipes that your ISP manages and provides access to a website, and then once those bits get to the website, who you have signed a EULA or agreed to a terms of service to use, they get to decide what to do with those bits. They get to decide to publish them or not publish them. So though an ISP is a common carrier, may or may not be seen as a utility, a website itself is more like a publisher that has editorial guidelines, curatorial mandates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Utsuho Reiuji, whose name I'm probably butchering, so I apologize, I think comes from, has a really interesting perspective, which is that there's maybe something desirable about the internet being on its face, privately owned, mostly, websites being owned by private entities, and them having sort of the kind of reactionary policies, let's call them, that we would expect a private entity to have, because we at least understand what we're getting ourselves into. We know that this is a corporation that has to, profit from ad dollars, from membership fees, needs to keep audience, blah, 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 and so we'll act in the interest of those things, as opposed to having an internet or places on the internet that are public in the sense that they are owned and run by the government and do not have those same restrictions or mandates that privately owned entities have, because really those government-owned public places on the internet would probably be just as bad, if not worse, but under the guise of being a public and open to all. So, at least there's maybe some honesty to this situation. Christopher Mora writes a really interesting comment that just makes me want to point out this idea that social media has such an intense power to dictate how we think speech functions. And how we think it should function. And I think that a corollary to this point is that a lot of times social media also has the power to show us or tell us what the internet is like. And I think that you see this a lot when someone famous gets, like Milo gets his account deactivated, or people leave Twitter, people leave YouTube because they can't deal with the harassment or the criticism, and you have people saying like, well, if you didn't like it, you shouldn't have come on the internet. That's just how the internet is. And this is interesting because the internet is a technological process, a bunch of technology designed and built by people. These are all decisions that people make and that we continue to make and that we maintain. And so there is no fundamental reason that the internet has to be that way. It's just the policies of places like Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, etc. have sort of trained us. We've become habituated to this situation and these characteristics. And so we think that's how the internet is, but it doesn't have to be that way. Luis Enrique Vargas Azcona brings up a really interesting point, which is that, there's another solution to this problem, which is being able to say whatever you want in all places, but just understanding that there is a sort of live and let live quality to the way social interaction has to happen in a complex and crowded space like social media and the internet. And this echoes several conversations that I had on Twitter over the week, where a lot of people say that, like, okay, we can design for harassment, we can design for blocking out hate speech if that's what we want to do, but another part of it is parties involved in interaction and conversation online understanding how to disagree with one another and not escalate conflict to the point where it gets, untoward, actually violent, or, actually harassing in some way. And I think that's, I think that's an interesting way to look at it. I think that's hard for a lot of people. And I think that it's maybe just as utopic as thinking that we can have separate spaces where free speech is fully available and speech is heavily curated, but is another way to look at it. Johan Winqvist disagrees and says that he thinks that it is perfectly reasonable and correct to describe places on the internet as such, as locations, that they are in fact locations, and that it would be entirely incoherent to discuss how the internet works and what it is if we didn't use such metaphors. And so that is how those things must be, that must sort of describe something about their metaphysical nature. And I think that my sort of response to this aligns pretty closely with Nakarino's comment that was on the subreddit, which is really good and sort of talks about how it might be the case that language itself, or at least English, I don't know how this functions in other languages, just might have a hard time with this. That we might literally not have the perceptual or the conceptual acuity to be able to describe these things without using all of these words that just almost get it. And so this comment is really great, also worth a read.